When my husband said he needed to talk, I was still folding clothes in the living room. I remember the smell of fabric softener, the distant hum of the television on unattended, and the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right in that late afternoon. He stood there without sitting down, his hands restless, avoiding my eyes. Before he even opened his mouth, I knew that nothing that would come next would be small. He took a deep breath, as if he had been rehearsing those words for weeks, maybe months. He said he was confused, that he no longer felt happy, that he had met someone at work. A colleague, older, more experienced. Someone who, according to him, understood his ambitions in a way I no longer did. As he spoke, he used a tone that was too calm, almost didactic, as if he were explaining a logical, necessary, mature decision. I continued folding the t-shirt in my hands, folding and unfolding, as if that simple gesture could keep me grounded in reality. When he finally said he was leaving, I felt an emptiness pass through my entire body, from head to toe. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I only asked when. He replied that it would be that very night. He said he didn't want to prolong something that was already over. He said I deserved someone better, as if that phrase could soften the abandonment. I watched as he walked around the room gathering some clothes, putting them in a small suitcase, choosing only the essentials. Each folded piece seemed to tear away a piece of the life we the wed pulled together. When the door closed behind him, the silence of the house became deafening. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the furniture, the walls, trying to recognize that space that suddenly no longer seemed mine. I sat on the still unmade bed and stayed there, staring into nothingness, feeling a confusing mixture of sadness, disbelief, and a dull anger that I still couldn't name. Inside me, however, there was something more, a secret pulsing silently, ignored until then, waiting for the right moment to surface. That night, lying alone, with my heart racing and my mind in turmoil, I still had no idea how everything would change. But deep down, something in me already knew that this story was far from over. The day my husband left didn't begin with shouting or slamming doors. It began with an ordinary late afternoon, warm light filtering through the living room curtains, the smell of clean laundry wafting through the air, and the television on at a low volume, like background noise trying to fill the house. I was folding clothes with automatic care, without thinking, when I felt his presence behind me. It wasn't a step, it wasn't a word, it was a weight in the silence, as if the air had suddenly thickened. He said my name in a strange voice, too polite for someone who shared his life with me. When I turned around, I saw that he hadn't taken off his coat, hadn't dropped his backpack, hadn't settled down. He stood there, his hands restless, his fingers touching and then letting go, his eyes averting from my face as if I could burn him. In that instant, my heart understood before my brain. I wanted to ask what happened, but the question died in my throat. He took a deep breath and said he needed to talk. That alone sounded like a goodbye. The words came with a calmness that irritated me more than any aggression. He said he was confused, that things between us had changed, that he had been feeling lonely, even by my side. I listened like someone trying to decipher a new language, searching for meaning in the pauses. Then he mentioned work. He mentioned a colleague. And when he said she was older, he tried to amend it as if it were an irrelevant detail, but he got stuck there, hanging in the air, because I understood what he wanted to say without saying it. Older, more confident, more established. The word wasn't age, it was superiority. It was as if he were comparing me to someone who had already learned to win, and I was still rehearsing. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was holding a t-shirt in my hands, folding and unfolding the same piece, as if my body needed a task to avoid collapsing. He explained that he didn't intend to hurt me, that he respected me, that I had always been good, always been a partner, but that now he felt something different. He said it wasn't my fault. And that's when I felt like laughing, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. Because it's not your fault always comes like a handout thrown to someone about to lose everything. When he finally said he was leaving, the phrase didn't come as an explosion. It came like a stone slowly placed deep in my chest. He said that very night. He said he didn't think it was fair to prolong it. He said he needed to live this truth of his. I watched his mouth move and wondered since when someone's truth needed to destroy another person's. He went to the bedroom and started taking some clothes out of the closet. He didn't take everything. He took enough to build a new routine without me. Each open drawer felt like a rupture. Each empty hanger felt like a small funeral. I followed him down the hallway without touching him, without begging, without fighting. My dignity at that moment was the only ground I had left. He walked past me through the door with his suitcase closed and looked at me in a way that tried to be tender, but was already distant, like someone saying goodbye to a place where they lived and don't intend to return. When the door closed, the click of the lock made a sound that was too loud. The house felt large, and I felt small inside it. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, as if searching for proof that I existed there. The table where we had dinner so many times, the sofa where we slept, embraced on lazy Sundays, the photo on the shelf with a smile that now seemed to belong to another woman. And in the midst of it all, I felt a sharp pain in my stomach, slight, almost imperceptible, and a nausea that rose slowly, like a warning. I attributed it to shock, to an empty stomach, to anxiety. It was easier to think that way. That night, in the darkness of the room, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand at what point I ceased to be enough. And at the same time, a persistent thought pounded inside, like a secret trying to breathe. There were things about me that he never saw. There were choices I made in silence, plans I kept to myself, and a detail of my body that I had been putting off facing. While he slept in another bed, perhaps already next to the older woman, I realized that the story he believed he was closing was only the surface. I still didn't know how or when, but I knew that something was about to be revealed, and when it was, nothing would remain the same. The days that followed stretched out as if time had lost its rhythm. Waking up became an exercise in courage. Opening my eyes meant immediately remembering that I was alone in that overly large bed. His side remained tidy, cold, as if it had never been occupied. I got up slowly, my body heavy, walked to the kitchen, and made coffee for one person, repeating gestures that were once automatic, but now required effort. His mug was still in the cupboard. I didn't have the courage to take it out. Small details became emotional traps scattered throughout the house. The messages started arriving, some full of indignation in my favor, others laden with unsolicited advice. They said I was strong, that I would overcome it, that he didn't deserve. I thanked them, responded politely, but no word reached the place where the pain truly resided. At night, the silence grew heavier. I wandered aimlessly around the house, sat on the sofa, got up, went to the window, watched the lights of the neighboring buildings, trying to convince myself that life continued outside, even though everything inside me was suspended. It was on one of those nights that the nausea returned, this time more intense. A sudden heat, my mouth watering, my stomach churning, as if something were out of place. I ran to the bathroom and knelt before the toilet, feeling a weakness that wasn't just sadness. When it passed, I sat on the cold floor, hugging my knees, breathing deeply. I thought about stress. I thought about irregular eating habits. I thought about anything simpler than facing what that feeling could mean. There was a part of me that already suspected, but I pushed the idea away like someone closing a door that doesn't want to open. Meanwhile, he seemed to move on with cruel ease. On social media, I saw new photos, smiles I recognized, restaurants we used to frequent, quick trips, a life reorganized without me in a matter of days. The older woman would sometimes appear subtly, a reflection in the glass, a hand in the background of the image. Each post was like a silent reminder that I had been replaced. Not just replaced, but surpassed, at least in the narrative he chose to tell the world. I went back to work, trying to appear normal. I kept to schedules, delivered reports, attended meetings. Inside, I was functioning on autopilot. People looked at me with barely disguised curiosity. Some knew, others just felt. I maintained my composure, but there were moments when I needed to go to the bathroom just to take a deep breath and hold back tears. My body began to give clearer signals. The tiredness was different. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical, deep, as if my strength was being slowly drained. I impulsively bought a pregnancy test from the pharmacy. On a rainy afternoon, when the sky seemed to reflect exactly what I felt, I left the box in my bag for hours, afraid to face it. When I finally got into the bathroom, I closed the door and took the test with trembling hands. I waited those eternity minutes, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the floor, trying to prepare myself for any result. When I saw the 2 lines, my heart raced in a terrifying way. I was pregnant. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and cried. It wasn't a simple cry. It was confused, mixed with fear, surprise, and a strange feeling of strength. I was pregnant by a man who had left. I thought of him immediately. I thought of calling. I thought of sending a short, objective message. I thought of his face when he received the news. But something inside me asked for silence. It wasn't the time. I needed to understand what this meant to me before sharing it with the man who had chosen to leave my life. I ran my hand over my still flat belly, feeling a bond being born there, silent and powerful. My story had just gained a new axis, and he still had no idea. After the initial shock, the days began to take on a new layer of reality. Nothing had changed on the outside, but everything was different on the inside. I continued waking up early, going to work, answering messages, but now there was a secret silently growing inside me, a secret that altered every thought, every fear, every decision. Pregnancy brought me a strange lucidity. While I felt vulnerable, I also felt strangely grounded, as if something had finally given me an axis when everything seemed to be spinning out of control. Doctor's appointments became part of my routine. The smell of the doctor's office, the distant sound of other women talking, the posters on the walls, everything seemed out of place in my recent reality. When I heard the heartbeat for the first time, a quick and insistent sound, I felt a wave of emotion that almost overwhelmed me. This was real. It wasn't a hypothesis. It wasn't a passing coincidence. There was a life there, connected to mine, independent of the choices my husband had made. I left the clinic with the test results in my bag, and the feeling that I needed to be strong in a completely new way. At the same time, I began to revisit parts of myself that had been forgotten during the marriage. It had been years since I'd thought about certain projects, certain decisions I'd made even before meeting him. One of them was something I'd always treated as secondary, almost a secret plan, an investment made at the beginning of my adult life, when I still believed more in possibilities than in security. I never talked much about it with him. When I mentioned it briefly years ago, he smiled condescendingly and said it was something for overly dreamy people. I let the subject die, but I never touched what was mine. One afternoon, I decided to access that old account. It was almost an impulse, as if something was pushing me. I opened the computer, typed in forgotten passwords, answered security questions that made me revisit older versions of myself. When the screen finally loaded, I thought there was some kind of error. I closed it and opened it again. The numbers were there, too clear to ignore. My heart started racing, and I felt a warmth rise throughout my body. What had once been a modest sum had transformed into something much bigger than I ever imagined. I read reports, opened documents, confirmed data. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't fleeting luck. I was a millionaire. I sat in the chair, unable to move for a few minutes. I laughed to myself, a nervous, almost incredulous laugh. I remembered every time I felt diminished, every time my ideas were treated as irrelevant, every time I heard that I needed to be more practical, more realistic, more mature. The irony was almost painful. Right now, when I was alone, pregnant, and emotionally stripped bare, life was placing me before a freedom I had never had. I decided not to tell anyone, not about the money, not about the baby, not yet. I needed time to assimilate everything, to understand who I was now. I began to organize myself in silence. I consulted lawyers, accountants, made plans, all discreetly. Meanwhile, he sent sporadic messages. He would ask how I was, say he missed our conversations, that he hoped I was okay. I would respond politely, without opening up, without accusing. Each of his messages sounded distant, like a voice from a past that no longer defined me. At night, lying in bed, I would place my hand on my belly and think about the future. I thought about the child growing up, unaware of the chaos that had preceded her existence. I thought about the woman I was becoming, someone who carried pain, yes, but also power, autonomy, and choices. For the first time since he left, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt like I was under construction. And I knew, with a silent certainty, that when the truth came out, nothing would be the same. As the weeks passed, the pain ceased to be a constant scream and became a background noise, always present, but no longer paralyzing. I began to reorganize my life with an almost frightening calm. Something within me matured too quickly, as if events had accelerated an inevitable internal process. The pregnancy progressed silently, protected by looser clothing, vague explanations about tiredness and changes in routine. No one suspected anything, and I liked it that way. That secret was mine alone, a sacred space where I still had control. I decided to move, not because the old house was small or inadequate, but because it carried too many echoes. Each wall seemed to hold conversations, promises, plans that no longer existed. I chose a bright place, with large windows, where the light entered early in the morning, a place without shared memories. When I signed the papers and received the keys, I felt something close to relief. It was as if I were finally opening a door that was only mine. Money made everything easier, but not simpler. It broadened possibilities, but also demanded decisions. I came to understand that wealth isn't just about having resources, but knowing what to do with them without losing yourself. I made investments, planned my son's future, thought about security, about freedom. All this while, on the outside, I was still just the woman who had been left by her husband. This public version of myself was almost comfortable. It protected me from too many questions, from unwanted curiosity. No one imagines the strength of someone who seems fragile. He remained present from a distance. Occasional messages, quick calls, always laden with a nostalgia that sounded more like guilt than love. He talked about work, about small frustrations, about how things weren't always as he imagined. He never directly mentioned the other woman, but she was there, invisible, occupying a space I no longer contested. I listened, responded politely, maintained a neutral tone. There was no pleasure in seeing him confused. There was only the realization that our paths had definitively separated. Sometimes at night I felt afraid. Fear of the future, fear of raising a child alone, fear that it would all be too much for me. In those moments, I would sit on the balcony, take a deep breath, and place my hand on my belly, seeking a silent connection, and it would come. A feeling of presence, of purpose. I was no longer living only for myself. That changed everything. I started therapy, not to understand the end of the marriage, but to understand the woman who emerged from it. I talked about the betrayal, about the feeling of having been replaced, about the implicit comparison with someone older, more experienced. I also talked about money, about the fear of becoming someone I didn't recognize. And for the first time, I said aloud that I was pregnant. Hearing it outside my head made everything more real, more solid. One ordinary late afternoon, I received a message from him, asking to meet. He said he needed to talk in person, that he felt there were unresolved issues. I read and reread those words before replying. Something inside me knew that this meeting would be important, not because I wanted to go back, but because certain cycles only close when faced head-on. I accepted. I arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, far from memories, at a time when I felt safe. When I hung up the phone, I stood there for a few minutes, looking out the window. The sky was clear, almost ironic. I knew that this meeting wouldn't just be a Adderson, it would be a test, a moment when the past would try, perhaps for the last time, to reclaim space in my life. And I needed to be ready to remind myself of who I was now, of what I carried within me, of what he never imagined I could be. On the day of the meeting, I woke up before my alarm. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the city begin to move outside, feeling the gentle weight of my breath and the insistent thought that this chapter needed to be navigated with clarity. I didn't dress to impress. I chose simple, comfortable clothes, something that would make me feel whole within my own body. Before leaving, I stopped in front of the mirror and observed myself carefully. There was something different in my gaze, a silent firmness that hadn't existed months before. It wasn't arrogance, it was awareness. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes before the agreed time. I sat near the window and ordered tea. While I waited, I watched people passing by, couples chatting, someone laughing too loudly, someone alone fiddling with their cell phone. Life went on in all directions, indifferent to the whirlwind that this meeting represented for me. When he entered, I immediately recognized his way of walking, but something was out of place. His confidence seemed less, his shoulders, a little hunch. He saw me and smiled, a smile that tried to be familiar, but no longer found the same space within me. He sat down in front of me and began to speak almost without pausing, as if the silence could swallow him if he stopped. He asked how I was, commented that I seemed well, different. He said he thought about me often. He spoke of work, of the pressures, of how some choices weren't as simple as they seemed at first glance. I listened attentively, but without getting lost. It was like watching a movie I'd already seen, knowing every twist and turn of the script, but no longer feeling emotional. He spoke of her, not by name, but by her absence. He said things were complicated, that there were differences he hadn't foreseen. He commented that sometimes he missed the tranquility he had with me, the partnership, the feeling of home. That word, home, echoed within me in a strange way. I thought of the new house, of the life growing inside me, of the completely different concept I now had of that idea. Home was no longer a place shared with him. It was something I was building alone. When he paused, he looked directly into my eyes, as if expecting some reaction. Perhaps a sign of openness, perhaps a lingering hurt. What he found was calm. I said I had gone through a difficult period, yes, but that I was okay. I said the end had hurt, but it had also been revealing. He frowned, as if he hadn't expected that response. He commented that I seemed more secure, more centered. He asked what had changed. I took a deep breath before answering. It wasn't the moment for revelation, not yet. I only said that I had started looking at myself again, at things I had neglected for a long time. He nodded, but seemed uneasy, as if he sensed there was something more, something beyond his reach. When we said goodbye, he touched my arm lightly, an old automatic gesture. I didn't recoil, but I didn't reciprocate either. There was an invisible line between us that could no longer be crossed. On the way back, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. That encounter confirmed something I already knew. He wasn't there for love. He was there out of doubt, and I was no longer the place someone returns to when they feel lost. I placed my hand on my stomach as I walked and felt a deep, almost sacred connection. I had new responsibilities, definitive choices to make, and above all, there was a truth that still needed to be told, but at the right time, a time that was approaching faster than I imagined. After that encounter, something settled within me. It wasn't joy nor sadness. It was clarity, as if an ancient fog had dissipated, revealing a path that had always been there, but that I could only now see. I spent the following days calmer, more present in my own body. The pregnancy began to show itself subtly, a different kind of tiredness, a greater sensitivity to smells, a heightened attention to every sensation. I took care of myself with a zeal I had never had before, not out of fear, but out of respect for the life growing within me. Money, which before seemed like an almost surreal event, began to integrate into my reality in a more practical way. I was no longer frightened when I looked at the numbers. They ceased to be a shock and became a tool. I used part of it to ensure security, another part to calmly plan the future. I thought about education, stability, freedom of choice. For the first time, the future wasn't a projection based on concessions. It was something I was designing with my own hands. I learned indirectly that his relationship was crumbling. Frequent arguments, demands, differences that could no longer be ignored. His older colleague, once a symbol of security and maturity, now seemed to demand a level of firmness from him that he couldn't sustain. This information reached me without weight. There was no satisfaction, just a silent recognition that idealizations rarely survive routine. I was no longer part of that story. He started contacting me more frequently, longer messages, calls at odd hours, a tone that mixed regret and confusion. He talked about mistakes, about thoughtless choices, about feeling he had lost something valuable. I listened, but didn't feed into it. I responded carefully, maintaining clear boundaries. Something in him seemed to realize that I was no longer available in the same way, that there was a new distance, not geographical, but emotional, impossible to cross. One quiet night, I sat in the living room of the new house, with the lights low, and seriously considered telling the truth about the baby, about everything. The fear returned, but not like before. It wasn't a paralyzing fear. It was a responsible fear. I needed to choose the right moment, not to protect him, but to protect myself and my child. The truth, I knew, would change the dynamic of everything. It couldn't be a reaction. It needed to be a conscious decision. I placed my hand on my belly and felt a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but real enough to move me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. That little life few no abandonment, betrayal, or loss. It only knew the rhythm of my heart, and that gave me unexpected strength. I didn't need to rush. Time, for the first time, seemed to be on my side. When he asked to see me again, saying he needed to be honest, I knew the definitive conversation was near. I accepted the meeting with the serenity of someone who had already made an internal decision. I arranged it in an open, bright place where I felt safe and secure. When I hung up the phone, I realized my hands weren't trembling. My heart wasn't racing. I was ready to finally close a chapter, and if necessary, reveal what he never imagined I was keeping silent. The day of our new meeting arrived with a sky too clear for the tension I felt inside. It wasn't anxiety like before. It was a silent, mature, almost solemn expectation. I knew that this conversation wouldn't just be about the two of us. It would be about everything that remained unresolved, everything that was said halfway, everything I kept silent about to survive. I spent the morning in silence, organizing the house, organizing my thoughts, as if each external gesture helped align what I needed to say. I didn't rehearse phrases. I didn't write anything. The truth I carried was already entirely within me. I arrived at the agreed-upon place and saw him before he saw me. He was sitting, leaning forward, fiddling with his cell phone, his expression tense. His posture was that of someone expecting judgment, not a reunion. When he looked up and recognized me, the smile he tried to form died before it could be completed. Perhaps he sensed something in me. Perhaps it was just intuition. I approached calmly and sat down opposite him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. He began by saying he needed to be honest, that he had made a mistake, that he thought he was making the right choice, but realized he had confused admiration with love, stability with feeling. He said he missed me, the way I understood him, the life we had built. As he spoke, I noticed how his words revolved around himself, his own frustrations, his own regrets. There was no malice, there was immaturity, and that somehow brought me an unexpected peace. When he finished, he looked at me as if expecting absolution. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my chest with a firm calm. I said I understood. I said the end had been painful, but also necessary. I spoke about the process of rebuilding, about learning to be alone without feeling empty. He seemed surprised by my tone. There was no accusation. There was no explicit resentment, just truth. It was then that he asked if there was someone else in my life. I shook my head negatively, but added that it didn't mean what he might be thinking. He frowned, confused. He said I seemed different, distant, as if I were somewhere else emotionally, and I was, completely. I looked at him intently, trying to find, in that face, some trace of the man I married. The affection was still there, but not the bond. Not anymore. I said I needed to tell him something important, something that changed the context of everything. He leaned forward, attentive, apprehensive. At that moment, I felt the real weight of what was about to happen. The revelation wouldn't just be information. It would be a watershed moment. But still, I didn't say everything. Not yet. I said that my life had taken unexpected turns, that I was going through profound transformations, that I was no longer the same woman he left behind. He tried to interrupt, asked if there was still a chance, if there was still an us. I gently shook my head. I said that some doors, once closed, don't reopen in the same way, that I needed to protect something very precious now. He remained silent, clearly shaken. There were questions in his eyes that he didn't yet dare to ask, and I knew the moment of total truth was approaching. Very soon, he would understand what he had lost. Not just a wife, but a life he never imagined I would build without him. After that encounter, I spent days feeling like I was on the verge of something irreversible. There was no going back to the old version of my life. The conversation with him left silent marks, not of pain, but of confirmation. Everything I had been feeling took shape. I wasn't running away. I wasn't postponing it out of fear. I was waiting for the right moment, and it arrived unexpectedly on an ordinary afternoon when I received a call from him with a different voice, tense, almost urgent. He said he needed to see me. He said he couldn't stand living in doubt anymore. He had ended the relationship. He needed answers. He asked, almost begged that I be honest once and for all. I arranged the meeting without hesitation. I didn't feel my heart race. I didn't feel my hands sweat, just a firm serenity, like someone who accepts crossing a bridge, knowing exactly where they are going to step. I chose a quiet, private place where we could talk without interruptions. I arrived punctually and found him pacing back and forth, unable to stay still. When he saw me, he stopped. His eyes scanned my face intently, as if searching for something that had always been there, but that he had never noticed. We sat down. He began speaking quickly, stumbling over sentences, saying that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He said he realized too late what he had thrown away. He said that the other relationship crumbled as soon as the idealization ended. He said that now he understood my worth. While he spoke, I felt a gentle sadness, not for myself, but for him, for his inability to understand, for the need to lose in order to recognize. When he finished, a heavy silence fell between us. I took a deep breath and felt, at that moment, that there was no longer any reason to hold back. I looked directly into his eyes and said that I needed to tell him two things, two truths that he was completely unaware of. The first came accompanied by a profound silence. I said I was pregnant. The words came out calmly, without trembling, but the impact was immediate. His face lost its color. He opened his mouth, closed it, took a deep breath. He asked if it was his, as if there were any doubt. I simply nodded. Before he could fully react, I added the second truth. I said that my financial life had changed drastically, that an old, discredited investment had transformed into something enormous. I said I was a millionaire. The words hung in the air, like something unreal. He looked at me as if he were a stranger. He tried to connect that information to the image he had of me, to the woman he left because he considered her insufficient. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It was the silence of belated understanding, of shock, of raw regret. I watched as he ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything at once. The pregnancy, the money, the woman he underestimated, the life he abandoned. And there, in that instant, I knew that this was the point of no return. Nothing that came after could be undone. He remained silent for a time that seemed too long to measure. He looked at the table, then at me, then at nothing, as if trying to reorganize his entire own story in a few seconds. I could almost hear the internal noise of the pieces colliding, of certainties crumbling, of memories gaining new meanings. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less confident. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. He asked if I planned to raise the child alone. He asked if there was still any chance to fix everything. Hearing those questions didn't provoke anger. It brought a definitive clarity. I explained that I hadn't told him sooner because I needed time to understand myself. Because pregnancy wasn't a bargaining chip, nor was money a bargaining chip. I said I spent months rebuilding my identity, learning to stand on my own 2 feet, creating a future that no longer depended on his choices. Each word was spoken firmly, but without harshness. There was no punishment there, only consequence. He began to cry, not in a restrained way, but like someone who finally understands the weight of what he's lost. He said he felt like an idiot, that he'd let go of the best thing in his life. He said that now everything made sense, that my change, my distance, my silence were signs he'd ignored. I observed the man with whom I'd shared so many years and realized that, for the first time, he was truly seeing me, not as a wife, not as support, but as an individual. It's a shame that this insight came too late. When he asked if I needed anything, if I wanted help, if I wanted him to be present, I took a deep breath before answering. I said he would have a place as a father, if he was willing to assume that responsibility with maturity and respect. But I made it clear that there was no longer room for us as a couple. There was no going back for something that broke the moment he decided to leave, believing I was replaceable. His expression changed. Pain, yes, but also understanding. I left that meeting with a strangely light heart, not because everything was resolved, but because I had told the whole truth without losing myself in the process. I walked slowly, feeling the fresh air on my face, life pulsing around me. I placed my hand on my belly and felt a profound peace. My son would have a whole mother, a woman who had known abandonment, but chose not to be defined by it. A woman who transformed loss into structure. In the following days, the consequences began to unfold. Difficult conversations, necessary agreements, respectful silences. He tried to get closer, but now within the limits I had established. There was no longer an imbalance of power between us. I didn't need to prove anything. My transformation was already complete. And while organizing the baby's room, carefully folding small clothes, I realized that this story, which began with rejection and pain, was heading towards a completely different ending than I had ever imagined. An ending where I wasn't left behind. I was the one who moved forward. The following months passed with a gentleness I never would have imagined at the beginning. The pregnancy progressed, my body changed, and with it, the way I occupied the world also changed. I walked more slowly, breathed more deeply, observed more. Every detail seemed laden with meaning. The baby's room was gradually set up, without haste, with choices made more by feeling than by ostentation. Despite having the resources for excess, I learned that abundance is not about exaggeration, but about choosing consciously. He was present, in his own way, learning, making mistakes, trying. There were difficult conversations, delicate adjustments, necessary silences, but everything happened within a new balance. I no longer diminished myself to fit in. I didn't over-explain. I didn't accept less than respect. He seemed to understand this, even if it still hurt. Sometimes I perceived in his gaze the weight of what could have been, not as disapproval of me, but as his belated learning. On quiet nights, sitting on the porch, I thought about the woman I was when it all began. The one who folded clothes without knowing she was also folding her own life. The one who believed she had been abandoned for not being enough. I wanted to be able to touch her shoulder and tell her that she wasn't being discarded, she was being freed. That the abandonment, however cruel it seemed, was the necessary push for her to truly find herself. The day I felt my son move strongly for the first time, I cried alone in my room. It wasn't a cry of pain, nor of fear. It was a cry of recognition. I survived. I grew. I became someone who doesn't beg for love, who doesn't negotiate her own worth, who doesn't lose herself to keep anyone around. The wealth I had acquired was real. Yes, but it wasn't the center of my victory. The true treasure was internal. It was the woman I became when no one was watching. Sometimes I wonder if he imagines how different everything would have been if he had stayed, if he had believed, if only I had waited. But those questions no longer belong to me. The past no longer calls to me. I don't live on hypotheses. I live on present choices, and my choice was to move forward with courage, with dignity, with truth. When I finally held my son in my arms, I felt a profound certainty settle within me. Nothing I had lived through was in vain. Every pain, every silence, every night I thought I couldn't cope, brought me to this point. I didn't lose a husband. I gained a life. I gained autonomy. I gained a future that doesn't depend on anyone's validation. And if someday someone asks how it all began, perhaps I will smile and say it was the day I thought I was being abandoned. Because in the end, I wasn't abandoned. I was awakened.